give us some really, really good food for thought, especially the perspective you just, talked about, how different the world looks almost, how different our understanding of spaces, our navigation of spaces looks from 4 generations before us. And that is really powerful. But also, when you speak of that, going back to that, or really leaning into the vernacular architecture side of things, you have more of a net zero effect in that scenario than what we do now.
Yes.
What's then, I guess, your vision personally? You're doing a number of things with Mambo Heritage, you can give us a bit more insight on that. I won't put words in your mouth, but you are doing quite a bit of work in this direction.
Right.
So I guess I'd just like to pick your mind on what your own vision is for sort of helping us or helping the rest of us see that a bit more, lean into, drawing from these authentic forms of design, of creating and reshaping our spaces.
Right. Thank you. I find myself in once again a very interesting space where when you hold that title interdisciplinary, you don't say that you're either this or that. So I find that sort of the DNA that Mambo Heritage and I myself have adopted is sort of this digital narrative archive approach to doing the work that we do. And what does this mean? I mean, for instance, we have taken it even to the point where we understand that there's sort of a retelling of stories that needs to come into play.
Yes.
For instance, we've looked at an old ruin here in Kenya, on the Kenyan coast, in Kilifi. We've gone and documented the Minarani ruins housed in Kilifi, and we've began to say, okay, we need to be able to tell a story that may be across a multitude of platforms.
Yes.
We're addressing tourism, we're addressing education, we're also just addressing the archive of knowledge that is housed within these various communities. Even so that there needs to be sort of an undressing of cultural identity, where we begin to say it's very unfortunate that Africans don't have much to talk about in terms of tangible spaces or tangible objects, which is a very sad story, because you and I find ourselves, say, in museums in England or in Germany, for that matter, and you're very clearly drawn to seeing the reason why the museum's in existence is because a multitude of those African artifacts are housed in these spaces. So to say that we have very little culture or product that stems, as far reaching as the mind can remember, or stories can tell us through archaeology, I feel that we're at a point now that is critical in the sense that there has been a decentralization that has been aided by technology.
Yes.
And I feel that in itself has leveraged the sovereignty of not only just one's national identity, but has also pushed to say, let us have a discussion about repatriation, even repatriation around veiled conversations. And I feel that it's a very pivotal time we find ourselves with the pandemic.
Yes.
The current climate that we're in, that people have had almost a moment to reset. And I feel that there is definitely a dawn of some form of digital African renaissance that is about to take its form, and it's heavily embedded in institutionalizing and commercializing its culture. And I feel that is on the precipice of being something far beyond people can imagine. And I feel that, for the technologists out there, such things like blockchain are probably that is the most innovative space and most challenging and calculating space that opens up a decentralized approach to sovereignty. And I feel that this in itself leverages not equal opportunity, but opportunity. Those who are present, those who are willing to be curious, can find means to address some of their problems. And I feel that also this is a sustainable approach to also managing distribution, maybe in resources, maybe in intellectual property. This is sort of a new narrative of where we find ourselves transitioning in the fourth industrial revolution.
How do you even bridge that?
So basically you're asking me what's the future looking like?
Yeah, but from your point of view, yes.
It's very interesting because I have a very different aesthetic measurement or metrics that I use to sort of evaluate maybe what we may call the science, the axiology of value in terms of what do you embrace and what do you not, what do you adopt and what do you exclude from this sort of from this transition space that we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
And this is more alluding to the fourth industrial revolution. I think the tools that are very explicit in African culture are heavily embedded in what we call evolutionary drivers. These are the interconnecting elements or principles that humanity holds as a biological being.
Yes.
And there's one thing that is indicative about Africans is our love for the arts, our love for music, our love that equally embeds itself in the way we breathe, and that is interconnected with nature. And I find that we're at a point where we are looking to build not only just the resilience, but we need to bridge the solidarity within the regional communities, may it be from a macro or a micro approach. We also need to look at the connectivity that comes with, the aiding of technology. What does that begin to look like as we, as Africans, have similar horizons and similar narratives that need to be readdressed?
Yes.
But then, how does that become sustainable? I feel that the paradigm within that is the measurement of such things like the evolutionary drivers juxtaposed against, these pillars of resilience, or these pillars of, an economy that we're beginning to speak heavily about.
Yeah.
So I think your question, in terms of, what does the future begin to look like, at least in the prism of my eyes, is so advantageous to the young African. The young African is just yelling to be tooled, is yelling to be resourced. Because from the work that I've expressed that we find ourselves doing, the ability to be creative, the ability to adapt and show resilience is not something that is lacked within the spaces I find myself working in. It is the lacking of the design of a system that is disadvantageous to these young individuals. And I find that technology is sort of opening that door and beginning to challenge the space of disadvantaged Africans or disadvantaged individuals within the African diaspora or the African narrative.
And they have, so would you say in a sense the process of this work that you're part of doing is actually taking the power back almost to communities of young Africans especially, to African communities, to our is it some sense of balancing out that power?
I think it's almost like, you can have an old vintage car. The body of the car is still very much intact.
Yeah.
The heritage of the car is held within the value of the user. And sometimes that could be a collective value that is shared across the board. Where we find ourselves right now is realizing that the car doesn't need to be, the traditional station wagon, seven-seater. We may be able to operate within the space of, say, a three-seating vehicle. And the transition or the specifics that we at Mambo Heritage are beginning to connect is the rewiring of a car that probably had one too many mechanisms in order to make it operate. And I feel that layer effect needs to be simplified. So, what am I sort of speaking about? I feel that it is more about the maintenance, not only of the body, but the maintenance of the mind connected to the body. So the car, as an element of mass, needs to have sort of the operational administration and leadership that can come into the mechanisms that say, okay, we have a steering. Who's the driver? We have passengers. Well, are the passengers internally engaged or are they externally engaged? Is this an ever-revolving vehicle that allows itself to always pick up along the way? Or is it, at point of voyage, at point of departure, 3 people are in, nobody else can come on. And I feel that what is beginning to happen is that Africans are realizing that the luxury of a product, and I symbolize this heritage car, juxtapose it to our public transport. We are community.
Yeah.
We are forever evolving. I feel that a heritage vehicle, once again, as an allegory, needs to be that matatu, it needs to be that public transport. It needs to onboard and offboard as we progress on this journey. It can no longer be I, me approach to solving problems. And that's
Like
why
that.
we still bring, I bring highlights to the interdisciplinary approach. And this is what has always been practiced within the confines of an African community.
Yeah, I mean, if you're to bring it down to one, a few words, Africa is about community. African culture across the board is about, fundamentally about community and that power that is, that emanates from community. And that, leads me maybe into something I became curious about as I looked into your work. You have worked across the region. You have been part of these conversations, designing spaces, reshaping, retooling. You've worked especially in my country, Rwanda, where in a time where really it was about rebuilding, re-envisioning spaces for, especially also for young people, young creative people, but also just across the board. You've worked in the region. What, if I may ask, is that broader picture that you have noticed? Is there any sort of larger picture you can help put together about how East Africans, as as a region, relate to their spaces, their urban spaces? What does that look like? What does that say about maybe our collective senses of identity, our culture, especially in the urban spaces? I'll be very curious to hear about.
It's an interesting question because I find that there's been so much conflict and value brought to the table through people's experiences. I mean, it is very interesting to see how we define the CBDs, the suburbs, the mixed-use spaces, which is sort of a European term or a Western term, and then how we define the peri-urban spaces around that. But juxtaposed amongst all of this as a hierarchy are sort of the informal spaces that house the big numbers in terms of population, the high-density spaces. I find that as sort of a footprint for telling a story of African settlement or African resettlement, because I still feel the ethnic kingdoms at which we draw ourselves from in terms of our personal individualistic identity is then brought into this melting pot within the urban infrastructure we call a capital city or a secondary town, what have you. A lot of that, of course, still has the bones of colonialism in terms of, how, the Tanzanians, the Rwandas, the Ugandas, and Kenyas operate. There's a very strong colonial footprint in terms of administration. And I feel that as an engagement has yet to be rediscovered and redefined, more importantly around a narrative that is speaking towards a generation that has very different needs from their grandparents.
Yes.
And I find that in itself is one of the underlying causes and effects that connects the region. And I feel that for what it's worth, leadership is at a position where they're really trying to not only manage matters around education and health,
Yes.
but I feel that there's something to be said heavily around the heritage and the culture of a group of people
Yeah.
who are connected beyond the definement of East Africa, the definement of the countries they come from. If there's one thing we all draw inspiration from, would be something like the element of water, the element of fire, the element of dance, the element of language. You know, these are our interconnecting elemental principles that bind us as Africans. And I feel that however you choose to veil the landscape of an urban space, bringing, you know, dance to a cafe, bringing music to a library, begins to sort of lead within the DNA of what is really innate within the African, or even, let me just be very, very honest here, the human psyche.
Yes.
It's within the human psyche.